Okay, Mr. Drysdale back here. For this lesson we are going to be talking about special right triangles again. Hopefully you've already watched the video on 45, 45, 90 triangles. In this video we're going to be covering 30, 60, 90 special right triangles. So as you can see over here we have a 30, 60, 90 triangle, which means 30 degrees, 60 degrees, and 90 degrees. Remember that triangle can be flipped around any which way, but this is how we have it set up for this one. The first thing that you want to do when you're solving a 30, 60, 90 triangle, especially when you're beginning, is to identify the small leg, the long leg, and the hypotenuse. Now this is pretty easy to do. Don't always go by looks though. Sometimes the legs will look really close to the same size and then you're guessing. But the way that you can be sure is to remember first of all that your hypotenuse is always opposite of your right angle. So if you find your right angle, your hypotenuse is going to be opposite of that. Your small leg is always going to be opposite of the smallest angle. So your 30-degree angle is your smallest angle. So opposite of the 30-degree angle is going to be your small side. And then of course opposite of your 60-degree angle is going to be your long side. Okay? So always label first of all the small, the long, and the hypotenuse. If you do that every time, especially when you're beginning, then you're going to set yourself up for success. The next thing we're going to do here is we're going to figure out what equals what. And the first thing is that the small leg, if the small leg is x, your hypotenuse is just going to be x times 2. So in English, that means that the hypotenuse is twice as much as the small leg. So if the small leg was 5, the hypotenuse would be 10. If the small leg was 100, the hypotenuse would be 200. If the small leg was 2 radical 2, the hypotenuse would be 4 radical 2. So they have that relationship where the hypotenuse is twice as much as the small. Same thing if you wanted to reverse that. Let's say we told you the hypotenuse was 10. We're going to divide by 2 to get the small, right? Because the small has to be half of the hypotenuse. So if the hypotenuse is 10, the small is 5. If the hypotenuse is 50, the small is 25. If the hypotenuse is 80 radical 3, then the small is going to be 40 radical 3. Okay? So we know that the small leg is the hypotenuse divided by 2, or the long divided by radical 3, which we'll get to in a moment. And we know that the hypotenuse is the small times radical 2. Or, I'm sorry, the small times 2. Excuse me. And last but not least is the long leg. The long leg is going to be whatever the small leg is, which in this case is x, times radical 3. So if the small leg is 5, the long is going to be 5 radical 3. If the small leg is 20, the long leg is going to be 20 radical 3. And we'll get into these more as we go. I'm going to give you some examples. Okay, for our first example of a 30, 60, 90 degree triangle, remember the first thing we're always going to look at are our angles. So it is a 30, 60, 90 triangle. Remember, sometimes it might be a 45, 45, 90 triangle. So we just want to make sure, first of all, that we're going to be using our right set of rules. So once we've established that it's a 30, 60, 90, remember the first step that you are going to do is then to label each side. So if you recall, across from the 30, that's going to be our small. So I'm just going to write small. You don't have to write leg, small's fine. Across from our hypotenuse, or I'm sorry, across from our right angle is our hypotenuse. So I'm just going to write HYP over there. And then, last but not least, across from our 60 is our long leg. So once we have those labeled, now we're going to ask ourselves, which sides are they asking us to find? Well, they give us the small. They tell us the small is 10. But they want us to figure out the hypotenuse and the long leg. Okay? So first let's figure out the hypotenuse. Okay? To figure out the hypotenuse, remember the hypotenuse equals the leg times 2. So the hypotenuse equals, let me correct that, the hypotenuse equals the small leg times 2. Be careful because you don't want to multiply the wrong one. So the hypotenuse equals the small leg times 2. So the hypotenuse equals the small leg, which is 10 times 2. So the hypotenuse equals 20. So there's your y. Hypotenuse equals 20. Now we want to find the long. So I'm going to do long equals, and if we look back on our cheat sheet, the long equals the small leg times radical 3. So the long equals the small, which is 10, still I'm just plugging in, times radical 3. And if you remember from the 45-45-90 video, we have a whole number and a radical. They don't like each other, so if it asks you to leave it in simplest radical form, our answer is simply 10 radical 3. Now, if they were to ask you to put that in the calculator, or I'm sorry, if they were to ask you to round that to the nearest tenth, then you're going to pop it in the calculator. So I'm going to just pop this in the calculator here. So 10 times radical 3 equals, and you're going to get 17.3205, blah, blah, blah. There's the 10th spot, so I look at the next number, 2. Okay, so it stays. So 17.3 would be that answer if they asked you to round it to the nearest tenth. So you've got to be very careful on the directions. Answer what they're asking you. If they tell you to leave it in radical form, leave it in radical form. So it's going to look something like this, possibly. If they ask you to round it to the nearest tenth, only then do you put it in the calculator to get your decimal, and then you're going to have to round, of course. Okay, here we have another 30, 60, 90 triangle, as we can see, 30, 60, 90. And so we're going to label our sides. So over here, there's our hypotenuse, right? So we'll do our hypotenuse. Then we've got across from the 30. Remember, that's going to be your small leg. So I can put small or short, whatever. I like to say small. And then across from our 60, that's going to be your long leg. So we're going to write long over there. Okay, so once we have those all labeled, now we can say what do we have and what are they asking us to find. So we are given this time the long leg, and we need to find the small leg and the hypotenuse. If you're given the long leg, then it's a good idea to try to find that small leg first, because once you know the small, then you can find the hypotenuse by doubling it. But we'll get to that in a moment. So let's do small equals, and if we have our cheat sheet, or if we have it memorized, it's the long leg divided by radical 3. So the small, now I'm just going to plug in, equals the long is 40 divided by radical 3. Now, once again, if we remember from before, we cannot have a radical on the bottom. So we have to rationalize the denominator. So we're going to multiply it by itself. And make sure you do it to the top also. So on top we have 40 times radical 3, which is 40 radical 3. I'll leave it separate. And then radical 3 times radical 3 is 3. Now we want to check to see, does 40 divided by 3, does that work? Does it come out equal? And the answer is no, it does not, because 40 divided by 3, you're going to end up getting a decimal point. So this is the answer to your small leg. Okay? So there is your small. So now, once we know the small is 40 radical 3 over 3, now we have to find the hypotenuse. And we know the hypotenuse equals the small divided by 2. So if the small is 40 radical 3 divided by 2, real easy here, just look at the whole numbers. Don't let that radical get in your way. 40 divided by 2 is 20. 40 cut in half is 20. So our answer is 20 radical 3 for your hypotenuse. So your hypotenuse is 20 radical 3. Okay, hopefully these couple examples helped you out. If you have any questions, feel free to find me, ask me, send me an email, come to my classroom, and I'd be more than willing to help you out. Thank you very much and have a great day.